is we're going to go, I apologize for my screen just glitching back and forth here. We're going to go into Zip Forms. And within Zip Forms, we're going to kind of go through some of the forms, but I'm going to share with you kind of what my plan is for probably what ultimately is going to be the next, I don't know, I'm thinking 5 weeks. I think this is session 6 or 7. So doing this in 10 weeks will probably work to do this in a 10-week session, but it won't work to do a 10-week session for 90 minutes per class. So I think I'd like to get some input from you guys. If we were to, not necessarily today, but if we were to do a 2-hour class instead of a 90-minute class, how do you guys feel about that? Is that too much time? Anybody have an opinion on that? Anybody want to talk to me? Mr. Soleil.
Norm used to do 2 hours class when we had it with Norm. It was 2 hours class.
Well, he did, but then at some point he changed that because the last 1.5 sessions that I did standing in for Norm was not 2 hours. It was 90 minutes.
Was it?
Yeah. But I remember having that conversation with Norm, and I think he suggested, and I ultimately agreed that the 2 hours was just, it's a long time to do this, guys. So, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give that some thought. We're going to run for 90 minutes today. I maybe, depending upon what sort of feedback we get, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit at the end of the class. We'll talk about doing a 2-hour session for the balance of our contract college, or maybe I'll just have to analyze that for when we restart. But the way it stands right now, I'm thinking we're probably going to need at least 5 more Thursday sessions to get through this, at least. So that's going to take us from 10 weeks to somewhere probably around 13 or 14. So again, today we ran into a little bit of a technical glitch. So what I want to do is share with you what our plan is moving forward so we can go from there. So we finished the RPA. So I'm just going to open up the RPA and kind of share with you what my plan is. By the way, someone give me a thumbs up or just tell me you can see the screen.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, so what we're going to do, and we are going to put this all back in Canva. The fact that I don't have this in Canva is frustrating for me. But what we're going to do is we're going to go back through the RPA starting today. And this may get tweaked, so I'm truly looking for some input for you. But what we're going to do is, in the order that the disclosures and the amendments and the addendums show up in the RPA, we're going to take those in that order for the remainder of our class. So for example, I'm on page 1 of the RPA, and as I start to scroll down, the first CAR form that's mentioned is the AD. Okay, so we're going to handle the AD, and we're going to go through that. Now, some of these disclosure, which by the way, that 103 forms, for those of you that actually read the text message, I may be off by 3 or 4, but I didn't just pull that number out of my hat. I went through every single addendum and disclosure that's mentioned in the RPA, and there's 103 of them. Now, some of them are mentioned twice. So we've got quite a bit of work to do here yet. So for example, the first one is the AD. So we're going to put that in the Canva, and we're going to go through, so you guys at a later date can go through chronologically through the RPA and say, okay, well, if I did want to go through it this way, and I got to page 1, first disclosure AD, boom, the AD is going to be there. So you guys will be able to use that Canva. You'll see that. Now, since we've already covered the AD in this class, I'm not going to do a full-blown explanation on that. Otherwise, this class is going to go to 25 weeks. So for example, to the first form that we would be going through today would be the AD. So I would just say, hey, AD would be up. We covered that 5 weeks ago. We're skipping. The next form is the ABA, which is the additional broker agreement. So this is the order I'm going to take these in. We have not gone over the additional broker agreement. So that's going to be the first disclosure that we're going to be working on today. And then if you follow through the form, and you won't have to go search for this, this is the part that, we had everything loaded and then the PDF blew up on us, and then the Canva thing blew up on us. So we're fixing that literally in the background. Austin's helping me fix it right now. So you guys won't have to go through and find these. We're going to make it nice and clean so you can go through, and maybe even before the end of this class, we go back into the Canva and then we can show the Canva there. So that is the plan. Drew and I had a little bit of a debate that, well, not really a debate, but he had mentioned it and I thought, well, yeah, you're probably right. So for example, I think when Norm taught this class last, or when I was teaching it for the last, 1.5 courses for Norm, I believe early on in the disclosures, we did what probably would make the most sense, which was, well, let's do the TDS and let's do the SPQ and let's do those. That probably does make a little more sense. However, if we follow my theme of we're going to start on page 1 of the RPA and we're going to work our way through, the TDS actually doesn't come up for a bit. So today, my thought is we're going to stick with these in order. We may tweak that a little bit and say, well, maybe it's a better idea to bring the TDS and move forward a little bit. So that is the plan. I will go back into the Canva here real quick just to show you guys where we're at. So this link right now does not have, I think Veronica, if I'm not mistaken, Veronica, are you on the, see who's on my participant group? Yeah, she is. Okay.
Yes, it
Yeah,
was me. It was
Yep.
me asking.
That was you. Okay, that was a great question. So, but if you have the question, I'm sure other people have the question as well. So Veronica texted me and said, where exactly are these 103 additional disclosures? And they will be right here on this link. Okay, so this is the first link on the link tree. If I click into it now, it's going to give me a PDF that has 43 pages on it. So if my math is correct, that's going to swell to somewhere around, 146 pages on this. Actually, not 146 pages. It's going to be way more pages than that because some of these 103 disclosures have multiple pages. So we're going to be well over 200 plus pages, which even with that, probably not going to be complete because Norm's class, when he was done, I think had 2 packages of 150, 200 pages each. So that's our theme. And then again, we will continue back into the regular Canvas section here and we'll start adding this up. But for today, we're going to think on our feet. We're going to improvise. So here we are. I'm just going to do this in zip forms for now. So where did my form go? Okay, so the first form we're going to do is the form ABA. So I'm going to do this the old fashioned way. So let me get back in here and oops. Come here, come back down here, go back to my forms. I don't know if Austin, did you pull these forms up in the existing contract college and zip forms?
Yeah, in contract college.
So in the listing 2023 contract
Yes.
college. Okay, cool. That helps. So let me go back over my forms. And we're going to look for ABA. And there it is. So can I open it from here? Doesn't even let me open it from here, but I got to come back over here, I think. Bear with me. And of course, they don't put these in order. There we go. Okay, so we have, or we're loading our additional broker acknowledgement. So this is the deal. By the way, same rules are going to apply, guys. If you have any questions, unmute yourself, just jump right in. We only have 12 folks here, so we certainly should be able to handle some interruptions as needed. So additional broker acknowledgement. I just went through this with Javier. I don't know if Javier is on the call here this morning, and he's not. He'll probably join us later, but him and I have had multiple conversations over this. So you are going to use the additional broker acknowledgement under some fairly rare circumstances for the most part, I would think. Okay. So basically you can make this an addendum to the listing agreement. In our example, this would be an addendum to the purchase agreement. We will be talking, and for those who are like, I said, wait a minute, Lance, you said we were going to start with the buyer's representation agreement. I fully intended to start with the buyer's representation agreement. And then I decided I wanted to present this in a different manner through the form. So we're going to get to that. So you could basically amend these agreements. In theory, you've got, as always with the CAR forms, you have the option to append a different form. I suppose we could rack our brains and figure out what the other form would be. But anyway, that being the case, I can't think of one at the moment. The date of the agreement, so if our RPA is dated February 1st, the date here will be February 1st. This is a theme that we will hit on over and over and over when it comes to addendums, disclosures, any sort of a modification of a prior form. Whenever you're making reference to the form up here, the date that goes here is the date on that form. So whatever the date of the contract is, or whatever the date is, whatever the amendment is that you're adding it to, is going to go here. In this particular case, this is going to basically be between brokerages. Okay. So it's the seller's buyer's broker and the seller or buyer broker. So this could be, a Coldwell Banker Town and Country and ABC Realty, whatever it happens to be. All right. This would not be a form. There's a separate form, which we're going to cover, which is the additional agent acknowledgement, AAA. I think I saw Chris here or Misty on this call. Yeah. Okay. So I see Misty. So if just using Chris Leeper as a team, so on Chris's team, if Chris and say Stacy are working together on the same listing or on the same contract, they would not use this form. They would use form AAA, additional agent acknowledgement. And then it in effect would tell the buyer or the seller, whoever they're trying to disclose this to, that says, hey, I'm Chris Leeper with Coldwell Banker Town and Country. I'm Stacy Guevara with Coldwell Banker Town and Country. We have two agents working on the same transaction. And in effect, they are now both associated with the deal. This is not that. This is two completely separate brokerages that would be doing that. The address normally, of course, would be the address of the property. I'll give you an example where this comes in. This could be used where, suppose I have a listing that I want to refer to Austin, and Austin is up in Fresno, and I live in Southern California, but this is my brother's house. And instead of trusting Austin completely with the referral and saying, hey, here's a referral, give me a 30% referral when I close of escrow, I'm like, you know what? I want to be more involved. It's my brother. I know he's going to be calling me all the time. So you're going to basically be the local representative at ABC Realty up in Fresno, and I'm going to also be on the transaction. That would be an example. I will tell you though, be careful with these. I don't like these. I don't like this for a whole bunch of reasons. Generally speaking, the main reason I don't like them is just from a standpoint of, if somebody's going to get sued, who are they going to sue? Who's keeping the file? Does that broker in Fresno keep the file the same way we keep the file? So generally speaking, I'm going to recommend that you guys avoid jumping into these agreements. Having said that, we have, that I'm aware of right now, at least 3 of these going on. So it's certainly not a hard stop, but I want you to give it a lot of consideration. So we have a listing agreement. ABC Realty broker number 1, XYZ Realty broker number 2. Then it talks about our co-listing brokers. So we're both listing brokers under listing agreement identified above. Of course, in this case, that would be 123 Main Street, and share responsibility for compensation for the representation of the sellers. Now you can define that. Okay. So exactly what is the responsibility and the compensation? So you would lay that out here. Okay. Now in theory, it would be laid out in the listing agreement because that's where you're going to be putting it, but you could put some additional things here. So it's be say, Austin's going to be showing the property and doing open houses and doing this and that. And for that, he's going to receive X amount of bucks. But all the file and the paperwork and the negotiations are maybe going to be done by our office. And for that, we're going to receive X amount of bucks. And it can be any version in between, or it can be just 100% shared. We're both going to work it. We're both going to negotiate it. We're both going to do all that. So for those of you that have never done this before, you can see how this can almost immediately cause all sorts of problems. Who is doing what? Who's keeping the file when the offer comes in? Who's negotiating it? How does that even work? So just be very, very aware. The same exact breakdown as if this is a buyer's representation. So in this case, with example 1, we're representing the sellers. Example 2, we're representing the buyers. And again, you have the exact same options there. What are we going to do for this buyer? What is Coldwell Banker Town and Country's role? And what is ABC Realty's role up in Fresno? So you get the exact same options. Item 3, purchase agreement or other, check one box only. If more than one applies, use a separate form for each. Pretty straightforward, pretty standard stuff. So you have your option between A and B here. Multiple brokers representing the seller. Okay, so again, this is broker one, broker two are parties to the residential listing agreement or whatever it happens to be, or multiple brokers representing the buyer. So it's the same exact thing. However, if in this case you're double ending it, okay, then you would have two separate forms. You would have one that says, hey, Austin and I are representing the seller. On the listing side, oh, guess what? Austin and I are also representing the buyer on the buy side. Okay, pretty clear, I think. Not, but like I said, all sorts of mud can be thrown into this. Paragraph 4 is quite operative. Activity under the broker's license 1 or 2 or both shall be conducted by multiple association license partners or teams as indicated in the attached agreement. Now we're getting to refer to Form AAA, the additional agent acknowledgement. So in effect, the activity that we're referring to is going to be, they're just saying, hey, we're going to have multiple licensees doing this. It's not just one. We're doing this together. Okay, unless you specified previously that, no, I'm actually not doing any of the negotiations. Office 1 is doing all the negotiations. All I'm doing is putting it in the MLS. Maybe that's my role. Matter of fact, Drew and I just did one of these. We had a Coldwell Banker broker who paid us, and the only thing that we did was put the property in the MLS. He was responsible for everything else. Drew, you're unmuted.
I'm not so sure we ever actually got paid on that.
Okay, well, there's that. So if you're, well, there you go. So now might be a good time to look that file up and see whether or not we got. By the way, that might be important. If you're going to stick your neck out, make sure you're going to get paid. So, but that would be an example of a transaction that Drew and I did. And I can remember I'm at the table in the big conference room, and I think Drew was giving me an eyeball saying, why are we doing this? This sounds ridiculous. I said, well, we're doing this because this guy's going to give us, I think, a 30% referral on I don't know, I think it was an $800,000 property. We did the math. It was a Coldwell Banker guy from Newport Beach. I'm like, yeah, let's leverage the relationship. And other than the fact that it sounds like we didn't get paid, everything worked as it should. We put it in the MLS, they negotiated it. And in effect, in that particular case, the activity under the broker was their broker. It was Coldwell Banker Realty down in Newport Beach. So then you've got your signing section. So again, who's broker 1? So this again, Coldwell Banker's license number, says by broker office manager. Honestly, I think in most cases, you guys are going to get us to sign off on these. You're not going to sign as the broker. Sometimes you guys, in certain cases, you'll say, hey, I'm, for example, in an agency disclosure form, it'll say Coldwell Banker Town and Country, and it's, by the agent. Well, you would sign as the agent representing Coldwell Banker Town and Country. In these cases, let's have Drew or myself or one of the managers sign off on these, assuming that we are broker 1 or broker 2. So we're going to plug that in. And then, of course, depending upon who the operative client is, they sign here. So this is a multi-task form. I represent the seller signs. If that's the case, there will be no buyer signatures on this. Okay, anybody have any questions? Actually, I take that back. There will be buyer signatures on this. I apologize for that, because we want the buyer to know who's being represented by who on part of the agency disclosure. Okay, any questions on our Form ABA? Okay, I'm going to keep on going. Now, this is where this is going to get a little bit wonky. So let me go back. Let me go back to our contract college here real quick. This will be easier for me to. This will be easier for me to navigate these forms. This is the form that Austin's updating as we speak right now. So let me go down to the RPA. Okay, where's my RPA? Okay, so here we go. So this is where we just left off. So we just did Form ABA. So now we're going to keep on rolling. Now, PRBS, we've already done that. Okay, so when we put the presentation materials together, the Form PRBS, possible representation, or more than one or buyers, there'll be a placeholder there, but we're not going to cover it in the class. So we're going to continue. We're going to continue on down the road here. So the next form that we're going to run into is Form DID, which has to do with our increased deposit. So here I am. So the next form on the RPA is increase deposit use form DID. So now let me bounce back over here into zip forms. And hopefully Austin has that in line right here. And there it is. Okay. All right. So DID, delivery of increased deposit. Now, generally speaking, guys, I'm going to suggest that you're not going to be using this form very often. Certainly, if you represent the buyer, you do have a certain amount of control over this form. And I would hope that in most cases, when I'm representing my buyer, I'm going to be able to sit back and say, hey, your earnest money deposit is going to be, $10,000. Do you have the $10,000? And I'm hoping that 95 times out of 100, they're going to say yes. In that case, I would not be using form DID because I don't need it. So this is on the contract when you're saying, okay, I want to do a $20,000 deposit, but the initial earnest money deposit is only going to be $5,000. The buyer agrees to put in an additional $15,000 within 3 days. If that's what you're doing, this is the form you will use. So under DID, delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages addendum, the following term, and by the way, because we have to now include the liquidated damages for the deposit as well as the initial deposit. So what are we doing? We are basically incorporating this into the purchase agreement. Again, you still have that box to say, well, and something else. I don't know what else. I suppose you could incorporate this into a lease agreement or something like that. But again, if you're using this, probably 99% of the time, it's going to be for an RPA. So you would plug that in here. The date that goes here again is the date of the RPA that was executed. The date of the RPA, the buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, seller, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. And again, what are we doing? Okay, well, by depositing on this date, the sum of $15,000. How am I going to do that? Again, for the most part, it's interesting that it doesn't give this option defaulted to wire funds. In the contract, the default is wiring funds. Okay, I'm telling you guys, stick with wiring funds. This is not 2010. 2010, people were scared of wires and everyone wanted to write checks or go down to the bank and get a cashier's check. But avoid cash. By the way, cash is an absolute 100% no-go. I don't even know why they have that on there. So cashier's check, I suppose, because again, keep in mind this money is being delivered to escrow. If you are doing this early on in a transaction and it has to be a personal check, so be it. I'd stay away from it. But wire funds is what you want to do. I have no idea what the other could be. We're going to do Bitcoin or Dogecoin or whatever. I mean, what else are we going to? Escrow is not taking any of that nonsense, by the way, guys. And it's wire funds, wire funds, wire funds. Who's it going to go to? It's going to go to Cobalt Escrow Company. Buyer here guy increases the total deposit to X. So whatever that increased deposit is going to be, this is where this would go. Okay. Now this is going back to the RPA because the RPA would say initial deposit's $5,000. Buyer agrees to increase the deposit by additional $15,000 within 3 days after acceptance. So that's where these dates would plug in. And then in here, what they're basically doing is by default, they're saying that this earnest money deposit is also subject to the liquidated damages clause. We cover the liquidated damages clause either last class or the class before. And that in effect says if the buyer's in breach of contract, the seller is entitled to the actual deposit not to exceed 3% of the purchase price. So the default in this says this deposit, in addition to the original deposit, is subject to liquidated damages. If you didn't want to make this deposit subject to that, you could check the box, I suppose. I would imagine there'd need to be some discussion onto exactly what that means. This paragraph here is basically pulled out of the liquidated damages clause, what it means. So you don't have to go back to the contract when you're explaining this to the client. You can sit back and say, this is what you're agreeing to with the liquidated damages clause. Buyer's going to, of course, seller and buyer are going to sign this and date. And we've got here buyers given additional deposit to broker who acknowledges receipt of additional. Okay, so if they've given you the funds, they've said, hey, by the way, here's a check. hold on to this check and you're going to deliver it to escrow in 5 or 6 days, which, by the way, in the old days, that was done all the time. Okay. We don't want you doing that. Okay. Because once you check this box and now that buyer gives you that additional check for 15 grand, we have trust fund handlings. You got to account for it in the logbook. You got to do all these things that we have been trying to avoid doing now for several years. And so do not do that. All right. Now, if you represent the seller on the listing side and you get this form and the buyers who works at ABC Realty or their broker at ABC Realty, if they're willing to take that funds and put it in their file and they're willing to do all the trust, then fine, no harm, no foul. But you guys don't do it. Stay away from it. Okay. Any questions on form DID? I'm going to pause for a second. I don't see anybody's. Let me get rid of a couple of these tabs. Oops. Sorry. Okay, I don't see anybody unmuting, so let's go back to where my page got. Lost my page. Here we are. Okay, so we just did DID. We're going to keep on rolling down here, and the next form is on page 1 of the RPA in the loan amount section, and we're doing FHA VA loans. So we have the FVAC HID form, or if it's just a VA form, the FVAC form. So let's go back, take a peek at those. Come back in here, go to my forms, and here we go. So we've got our FHA VA mandatory clause. So this is the deal. Anytime you guys are doing an FHA VA, this is required. You have to do this form. Okay. So what do we have here? Pretty straightforward form. The oversimplified explanation of this form is the property has to appraise. That's really what this is really truly all about. And that there's no less than arm's length transactions going on. We're not doing something, out of the ordinary, which of course we don't do. So what are we doing? We're amending the purchase agreement. Again, I'm going to stop giving these silly examples of, well, what else could we be amending, Lance? Well, I don't know. Okay. For 99% of the time, you're going to amend the purchase agreement. That's why it's the default. Property, and again, the date of the purchase agreement. I know it's a broken record. Property address, who's the buyer, who's the seller. The standard buyer and seller are referred to as parties. And in effect, what we're talking about here is FHA VA want to lend on properties where the property value is the purchase price. So what you would do on this form, I've got a contract for $450,000 and the property has to appraise for $450,000. If that doesn't happen, we're starting over again. Not necessarily completely over again, but in effect, the property needs to appraise. So that's what this form is all about. There's a certification section in effect says that the buyer and the seller and the brokers and everybody certify that the terms of the contract are true and correct. And bottom line, this is kind of like there's no shenanigans going on. Okay. What could the shenanigans be? Well, the purchase price is X, but the reality is the house isn't worth that much because we've lumped in a Corvette into the purchase price. Or we've had this happen. Matter of fact, I think there might be an agent on this Zoom call who tried to do this game once, where let's suppose there's some super duper high-end appliances in the property. Okay. Some $8,000 cooktops and some $20,000 refrigerators. These are built-in fixtures. And they do create value. They create value on this property. We don't have a lot of these in our normal Inland Empire, standard houses, but if you're doing some high-end stuff, there's some value. You could have $100,000 worth of kitchen appliances. Okay. Where the appraiser thinks they're included. And then there's a side agreement, and the side agreement, and granted, this wouldn't apply on an FHA deal, I understand, but go with me on my example. And the side agreement is the seller is going to take them with them. Okay. And the buyer understands that. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. I don't like it, but you're going to take those away. So whenever you're doing any sort of side agreements on a contract anyway, you're running into trouble. Not that they're illegal. Side agreements that are disclosed can be done, but any undisclosed side agreements, and in this case, if you're doing that with an FHA deal, you're running afoul. So that's what the certification is about here. And then of course it says if you do knowingly break the law, they're going to throw you in jail for 50 years or something like that. Okay, buyer signs, seller signs, and then of course, the respective buyers, agents, and buyer's broker and listing agent broker are going to sign, put their date and licensing information in here. Any questions? Okay, the next form on our group is Form HID. By the way, the FHA VA clause is for both. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you're doing FHA, it's the same form that we just reviewed. The Form HID is next up on our hit parade. So let's come back over here. And the HID, while I'm pulling this one up, guys, with the HID, it's critical that you use this and that this gets signed at the time the offer is done. Haven't really had this. Austin, did you pull the HID? I don't see it on here.
I did, yeah.
Of course, these are not alphabetical. By the way, Austin's sitting right next to me, guys, if you guys are wondering where I'm. All right, well, I don't see it. Let me see if I can find it over here. Well, there it is. Oh, you know what? I probably have it sorted improperly. For your protection, let's close this up. Come back to my forms here.
I uploaded that one to the Canva. It needs that.
Well, yeah, I don't want to go back and forth right now. We'll just stick with what we're doing for today. For your protection, get your home inspection. Where is it? These things aren't alphabetical, of course. You guys know if I can search these? Is there a way to search my forms? Someone help me out here if I'm struggling. Oh, here it is. Right where it's supposed to be. Okay, now the tip on this one, guys, is I haven't had this happen in a long time, but I've had it happen, and I'm assuming that the rules have not changed. This form, if you're doing an FHA deal, this form has to be signed and dated the same day as your offer. So for example, if you have an FHA buyer and you get everything signed, but you forget to have them sign this form and they sign it at the end and then they send it into underwriting and the date is different than the contract, I believe your loan officer and your lender is going to call you up and say, we've got some heartburn. So just make sure, going back to the original contract, and let's go take a quick peek at it. When you're at this contract and you're checking, I'm going to do an FHA loan, and you check FHA, you've got both of these forms, the FVAC and the HID. Do not forget to get that HID form. So what do we have here? Basically, this is the for your protection, get a home inspection. And I'm not going to read this to you. You guys can go through this, but it basically tells the buyer that appraisals don't warranty anything. Just because it's FHA, a lot of agents don't understand this. I've certainly had buyers that haven't understood this. They think because they're getting an FHA loan, there's some sort of additional protection or some sort of an additional warranty associated. No, there's not. There absolutely is not anything additional. I mean, you still got to do your stuff. Again, I don't know why they decided to call out radon. You know, it seems to me like they could have called out a whole bunch of other things. Why didn't they mention, mold, or didn't they mention, lead-based paint or whatever? But, said, hey, maybe I want to test for radon, whatever it happens to be. And then it just talks about making sure, whoever you're going to hire is a professional. CAR does stick their neck out, and they're basically endorsing the American Society of Home Inspectors. So that being said, whoever your favorite home inspector is, probably not a horrible idea to make sure that they are part of the American Society of Home Inspectors. I could see some concerns and liability with that you recommended somebody who was not part of this. And I generally think most everybody who's doing this business is. So again, this is going to be signed by your buyer and your buyer only, nothing else. The seller, not for the seller to sign on this. So make sure you get that HID form. Okay, now we're going to segue into, I'm just working my way down the contract. So there's nothing else on page 1. And then we get to roll into this brand new, beautiful edition on the top of page 2. item G318. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. So as of this class, we are February 23rd, 2023. As of today, Coldwell Banker Town and Country agents, I do not want you checking this box in any way, shape, or form unless you truly have got yourself a buyer's broker agreement. If you do, then fantastic. But most of you are not using this. Make sure that if you are, fine, but if you're not, understand what this form is, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding about this. So until further notice, you're not going to use this form. I spent hours and hours and hours talking about this at CAR, but let's take a peek at it. It's on the form. You guys need to understand this. And this is why I said, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we're going to cover these forms first. Well, guess what? We're getting to it. So it just wasn't the first form up today. So we want to go find form SPBB. So let's roll back over here, come back to my forms and see if I can find this form without scrolling through the way I did last time. There we go. SPBB. So now when you're using form, and you're going to see this as we go, and I don't know if I queued up Austin completely to work our way through this. If not, we'll struggle through it. And again, I promise we'll get this thing all cleaned up and nice and pretty before next Thursday. So what this is, guys, and we briefly talked about this 3, 4, 5 weeks ago in our sales meeting, and I honestly don't think we did it justice. So even though I'm telling you guys, don't use this, you really need to understand this form. So if I don't get at least 1 or 2 of you asking some questions, I'm going to be a little concerned that maybe you're not paying attention. So let's jump into it. So what do we have here? Seller payment to buyer's broker. So the oversimplification of this form is how we've been doing business for 100 years is I go out and I sign a listing agreement with Austin. He's my seller. He agrees to pay X amount of percentage of a commission, and a certain percentage of that percentage we are going to pay to the cooperating broker, the outside broker. So I'm Coldwell Banker Town and Country. Austin's paying X to Coldwell Banker Town and Country. A portion of X we're going to put in the MLS and say we're going to offer this to the outside broker, Sally at ABC Realty. So this basically says this is how much money is being offered to Sally at ABC Realty, who represents the buyer. And this whole point of these forms is, does the buyer and seller understand who's getting paid, who is paying that person, and how much is that person getting paid? So let's go through it. So we've got the following terms are incorporated into the purchase agreement. Again, 99% of the time, that's going to be it. What is the date of the purchase agreement? What is the address? Who is the buyer? Who is the seller? No, now we've got that. If this looks familiar, this is the same language that's in a listing agreement. So this is telling, again, the buyer is getting this form, at least at this point. The seller already got a form when they signed the listing agreement. And in the RLA, what did it say? It said this exact same notice in the residential listing agreement. And that is the amount of real estate compensation is not fixed by law. It's set by each broker. It's negotiable. All right. So that's part of what these lawsuits are all about, is they want the buyers to understand that commissions can be negotiated and they're coming from different sources. So right out of the box, they're telling the buyer that whatever these numbers say, that's fine. But if you want to negotiate these numbers, you can negotiate it. So right off the bat, it says the buyers entered into a written compensation with their broker, which is a different form. Okay. So that's not this form. It's a different form, which we're going to get to next, I hope. And in that form, the buyer's broker is going to get X amount of percent of the purchase price. So, so now Sally, let's just say I represent the buyer, make this easier. So Austin's now my buyer. I've said, Austin, this is the deal. We're in a new world of real estate. You're going to pay me. All right. And by the way, I won't work for less than X percentage of the sales price. Are you going to pay me that? Austin says, yes. Sweet. So I put that percentage in here. Austin agrees me to pay X percent of whatever, and this is coming from him. So now not only does he have his down payment and his closing costs, guess what? He now has to give me 30 grand. This is one reason why in practice, This is going to be a problem. This is why the people who are regulating this industry may not fully understand that the way we do this now tends to work pretty good and most buyers tend to like it. But in this example, the buyer pays me, not the seller anymore. I can also have a number. It can be a percentage, 3% of the purchase price, or X amount of dollars, 30 grand, whatever it happens to be. As of the date, this seller payment, let's back up on this. This is the buyer who's entered into a written agreement. Okay. As of the date, as of the date this seller payment for broker's document is signed. Boy, is that a mouthful? The buyer, and pursuant to the MLS of X, selling brokers agreed to pay buyer's broker X or X. So what does that mean? So basically it's saying as of the date that this gets executed in the MLS, the seller has already agreed to pay me. Okay. The seller says, I'm offering 3% compensation to the cooperating broker. Well, wait a minute. Austin has already agreed to pay me 3% of the agreement. There's no double dipping. All right. So if that's really what they're trying to clarify here. So if there's already 3% compensation coming to Lance or Coldwell Banker Town and Country, then the 3% that Austin has agreed to pay me here basically isn't going to apply. Okay. Where this would come in, let's suppose Austin has agreed to pay me a 3% commission, but the listing agent on this particular house says, well, I'm only offering 2%. Okay. That's where we need to know what that differential is. And then basically the difference is what Austin would ultimately pay me. So in that case, I would get 2% compensation from the listing office, and I would get the difference, or 1%, from Austin at close of escrow. That's really what this is trying to do. Does this work in real life, in practice? Probably not so much. So, and this is not new, by the way, guys. I've been doing this forever, and back in 89, 90, they're pushing buyers brokers agreements. And I even tried it for a minute, and all the buyers were like, what? You want me to do what? I can barely get my down payment together. I can't pay you a commission. I said, great, don't worry about it. So that's where the math is going to go up here. What's the compensation? How much has the seller already agreed to pay? And then you can go through 4 and 5. It kind of goes through what I talked about. Buyer authorizes escrow holder upon request to deliver a seller copy of the portion of the written agreement. Okay. So again, and they're basically what they want to do. We're comparing. Is it different? Okay. If the amount is different, then we have to do the math and figure out how the additional compensation is getting paid. If the buyer's broker is the same as the seller's, then the amount specified in the MLS shall apply. Okay. I already went through that. So is that clear? You understand what we're doing? I don't see anybody unmuted.
Clear as mud.
Clear as mud. Okay. I like it. So, and the reason I paused there is because this form was being explained to, in theory, some fairly smart people at CAR. Some of these people sat in committees that created this form, and it was clear to me half the people in the room didn't understand it. So, okay, so clear as mud. So we will go back and do the buyer's broker agreement later, but I'm going to go ahead and stick with my form. And again, I may modify this next time we do this. So we're back here. So we just went through the SBBP. I'm going to keep on rolling. And as I come down, the next form, I'm on page, what page am I on? On page 2, the next form that the contract calls for is a contingency removal. So the CR form basically lines up with everything in paragraph L. Okay. Loans, appraisal, property inspections, access to the property, review of the seller's documents, the prelim, all the homeowners association documents, anything that's leased, whatever happens to be solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So contingency removal. And again, this is where I'm kind of wondering, is this the correct order to do this in? Maybe not, but anyway, we're going for it. So now we're going to jump over, go to the CR. So let me come back here at all my forms. And CR. Contingency removal. Okay, so here we are. We've got form CR. I will tell you, I've been kind of harping in some of these classes in our sales meetings. I'm not seeing from our agents a lot of notice to buyers to perform, or not a lot of notice to sellers to perform. But I will tell you, I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of CRs that I'm seeing. I do see a lot of contingency removals, and I see multiple contingency removals. So if you're doing this already, pat yourself on the back, because it's important. You want to basically use these CRs regularly. And just so you know, and it seems like newer agents tend to struggle with this. You can do a CR for a loan, and then the appraisal, and then the inspection, and then the termite. You can parse these things out. Nothing wrong with doing that. Agents tend to kind of wait. I'll do it when I have everything to remove. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you certainly can have more than one. So let's go through it. And again, as you can tell, as with a lot of these forms, you'll have a contingency removal form, and then you'll have number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever it happens to be. So if you are doing multiple contingency removals over a period of the transaction, then just be aware to keep your numbers straight. The first one, I remove the inspection. The second one, I remove the appraisal. The third one, I remove the loan, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so here we are. By default, we're basically amending the purchase contract. Again, we could do interesting. They actually, I just kind of noticed this right now. They by one of the boxes to check. I don't know if I would have done this, but they said, hey, let's do the purchase agreement. Wait a minute. Nope. Let's do an RR. Nope. Let's do an RR. So those options are built in, or again, it could be another form. So whatever form that you are referring to, it's the same thing. Their date goes here, property address, buyer, seller. Buyer, sellers are parties, same thing. Buyer's removal of contingencies. Okay. So in effect, the beginning of this form, let's get down here to the bottom. We have a little bitty section here. I'm going to skip down to the bottom. If you're removing seller contingencies, you're going to skip all the way down here to paragraph 6, and you're going to remove your seller contingency here. The majority of the contingencies are buyer contingencies. So the bulk of this form, item 1 through 5, deals with the buyer's side. So what is the buyer doing here? Buyer removes only the following individual checked contingencies that I was just talking about previously. So I want to do the loan. Fair enough. I want to do the appraisal. I want to do the inspections. I want to do the specific inspections or the entire inspections. All the inspections except the home inspector said there's something wrong with the air conditioner, and I'm happy with the entire house except the air conditioner. So there is no right or wrong order to doing these. However, logically, you're probably going to move inspection contingencies maybe before you're going to remove an appraisal or a loan. Appraisal takes longer potentially, loan takes longer potentially. The prelims, quite honestly, guys, I don't normally see these being removed individually. I generally see prelim contingencies being kind of removed almost at the end. But in theory, if you were a listing agent and there was something particular about this house, and you wanted to make sure the buyer was going to sign off on that prelim, you could emphasize, hey, I know you're not ready to remove other contingencies, but I want that prelim contingency removed. Then, of course, you have buyers removing everything except, okay. So if you got some options here, and this would not be uncommon. Hey, I'm happy with everything. The appraisal's in. I just don't have my final loan contingency. So you check box 3A, and then you check loan. And then that would, of course, would stay in place. And then, of course, what we're really looking for is item 4 to be checked. At some point, hopefully you get to item 4, and in effect, the buyer is removing everything. Again, pretty straightforward form, guys. I'll pause here for a second if there's any specific questions, at least on the buy side. I don't see anybody unmuted. Okay, we skipped down here, but let's take just an extra second to deal with seller contingencies. In this marketplace, I gotta tell you, it's gonna be a little bit tougher for sellers to, hold out and say, hey, I need to, when we're waiting on buyers. Matter of fact, this just happened. I don't know if, I can't remember who called me. I think it was Medelli. She's not on the call today. She called me and she's had a property that's been on the market for a little while, and they're getting a little nervous, and they had a buyer, and they wanted to know, hey, should we accept the buyer's contingencies? And I said, sure. And we started talking about sellers contingencies. I got to tell you, when you're in a hot seller's market, sellers can get away with putting in, hey, subject to finding a replacement home or subject to closing on my replacement property. In this market we're in right now, I got to tell you, your sellers need to be prepared to get their ass boxed up and out. keeping those contingencies in place could be problematic. But if you did find it in the replacement property, you would remove it. And if you went to the step of, oh, wait, it's got to close, then you could remove your SPRP form here. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. Any questions on our CR? Okay, seeing none. As I continue to scroll down, the next form that we have is the COP, kind of just touch base on that. Sale of buyer's property. Okay, so again, the default, by the way, in the RPA is it's not a contingency. It's very clear, not a contingency unless checked. So if they check it, let's go to form COP. Get back over here. My forms. And well, I tell you, I know I love doing this in Canva. Nothing makes me realize how much I love doing this in Canva than doing it the way we're doing it right now, because this is a pain in the butt. Okay, so contingency for sale of buyer's property and notice to remove contingencies, form COP. So here we are. Again, we're amending the purchase contract, dated XYZ date, property address, buyer, seller. Now here, you need to put in the buyer's property. So this is the property under buyer's property that they are selling. You have to identify what they're selling. I'm selling 123 Main Street in the city of Riverside. Okay, so you're going to plug that in. By paragraph 1A is the default. 1A is the default. Buyers entering into a contract of sale and close of escrow on buyer's property. So it's contingent upon that. Okay. Entering into a contract for the sale of and closing on the buyer's property. So it's the whole McGillicuddy. I got to get it in escrow and I got to close on it. Or B, check the box, only entering into a contract or sale of the buyer's property. That would be kind of weird. Because if it's not closed, then you kind of sort of got a problem. So, hey, there are some sellers or buyers that would do that. I can't imagine most of you are going to be checking paragraph B, because that's this doesn't work for anybody. But anyway, you guys can read it. So if you did check paragraph B, it's only contingent upon the buyer's property going under contract. Okay, not closing. Or C, only the close of escrow of buyer's property, paragraph 4, which is already in escrow. Okay, and again, generally that's kind of what we're looking for as well. So in this case, it's nice because now it's not contingent upon the property being sold, in effect having a contract accepted. We've already got that part. That part's already done. Okay, so if I am the listing agent, I prefer 1C being checked. When 1C is checked, hey, at least you already got the property in escrow. I have an escrow company, Cobalt Escrow. I have an escrow number, which is great. And I am basically I'm rocking and rolling. Okay. Paragraph 2, buyer and enter into contract of sale of buyer's property if 1A or 1B applies. So in this case, if the property is not currently in escrow, okay, hey, I got to sell my house, but I don't have a buyer for it yet. Okay, you with me? Then paragraph 2 applies. And by default, buyer has 17 days to get it under contract. Okay, does that give them enough time? I don't know. So if you're representing the buyer, you just got to understand, you're saying, okay, we're going to try it for 17 days. If we don't get a buyer for our property within 17 days, in effect, decisions need to be made. Is the seller willing to extend? Am I going to blow it out? This was the transaction that Melly was asking me about. She wanted to keep it at 17 days. The buyer's agent had put in 30. They wanted 30 days to get their property under contract. Probably not unreasonable if you're the buyer, but it is what it is. Or again, you can go into, by the earlier of time specified in 2A. So that would be 17 days by default, or within 2 days after buyer and enter in a contract of sale on buyer's property, buyer shall deliver escrow instructions to the seller. So basically you got the 17 days, or 2 days after they do it, they got to get it in. So if they enter it within day 10, we got to get a copy of those escrow instructions delivered and evidenced to the seller and to the escrow holder. So show me that you've got it in. Now, the bottom line is if this doesn't happen, I don't know if it says it on this form. I don't see it here, but what you basically would end up doing now, the seller has to trigger their notice to perform, buyer to perform, or remove your contingency. So, hey, I'm not going to wait another day 18, day 19, day 20. You at least got to get this sucker in escrow. Again, if it's not in escrow, but it's listed, you need to disclose to the seller and the listing agent that, hey, the buyer signed the listing agreement. Here it is. I'll get you a copy of it. It's listed with Coldwell Banker Town and Country, and here you go. So, or if it's not listed, think about that. I'm the listing agent. Drew writes me an offer for his buyer subject to the sale of his buyer's house. And then I find out that that house isn't even on the market yet. So really, I think that's a flat out rejection. So this in effect is saying this is all the listing information that applies to the house that my buyer needs to sell. Close of escrow buyer property. And again, this is normally kind of how this goes. If 1A or 1C applies, buyer has until the filing time to close escrow on the property. If the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property, if checked no later than 5 days prior. Ooh, okay. In effect, 99% of the time, guys, you got to close the buyer's escrow first before you close the seller's escrow or the house they're buying, for the obvious reasons. Number one, they need the money. Okay. And a whole bunch of other reasons. So that's what they're referring to in paragraph 4. Status of the sale of the buyer's property. Again, where are you in the process? Basically, this is just says, hey, I promise to keep you informed. Need to give you regular updates. I've got to sit back and say what's going on. So when the listing agent's calling, you're like, yeah, it's going along fine. We'll let you know. And I want more than that. They could say, did you hold an open house? How many showings have you had? How many offers have you had? Oh, you had an offer. Give me some information. So the buyer is agreeing to keep that seller in the loop. Cancellation of buyer's property. If the buyer's property is in escrow or either party gives the other party notice of cancellation, this happens all the time. Okay. So, hey, you enter into contract, the buyer's property is in escrow, and then it falls out of escrow, but the listing or the buyer's agent fails to tell anybody on the other side, oh yeah, by the way, we fell out of escrow the day after your offer got accepted. Well, that's a no-no. You know, you have to notify the seller and their agent that says, hey, my contingency just fell out, right? Makes perfect sense. Backup offers. So this is kind of where, if you're on the listing side, you want to really kind of pay attention to the backup offer side of this transaction. And by the way, guys, I don't recommend you accept these. And I know I don't live in a perfect world, but if you can avoid, as a listing agent, writing offers subject to the sale of the buyer's property, avoid it. Honestly, I would rather just wait. You know, hey, go get your property under contract, get 2 weeks close before you're going to close escrow. On those conditions, I'll be a little bit better. Come to me with your property under contract. Show me that contract that says the buyer has a $50,000 non-refundable deposit. They got $1 million in the bank. They've got a full loan approval. All contingencies have been removed, and you're going to close escrow in a week. I'll accept that all day long. Okay. But I want to try to get as many of those boxes checked as possible, because quite honestly, what I'd rather do, if I represent the seller, what I'd rather do is say, no, we're not going to accept this. We're just going to wait. Okay. This is one reason why I absolutely hate in the MLS that status active under contract. I don't want to be a listing agent that has listings that say active under contract. I just don't. Now, again, market's changing. Maybe I'll modify my position on this a little bit, but let's get back to the form. So backup offers. After acceptance, sellers have the right to continue to offer the seller's property for sale and for backup offers. Kind of sort of what we want. Removal of buyer's contingency and proof of funds. Unless paragraph C3 down here is selected. If seller accepts written backup offer and provides a copy to the buyer of the accepted backup offer within whatever the time frame is, seller has the right, here we go, this is the operative part, seller has the right to give written notice to the buyer in writing to remove their contingency. Okay. So if you're going to do that, that's what you want to do. Seller has a backup offer. I put it in the MLS, active under contract. I like this backup offer. I tell the backup offer, I said, stand down. I need 2 days to go over to buyer number one. And if they don't remove contingencies, I'm canceling buyer number one and I'm moving forward with buyer number two. Now, again, I don't like that either. I mean, it's better than the alternative, but I partially don't like it because if I'm the buyer number two's agent, I'm like, really? You mean, I know, I'm going to go through all this trouble. I'm going to write this offer and you've already got an offer accepted. I know it's contingent. Maybe we'll just go find another property that doesn't have that. But this basically is what that gives you the right to do. You're in effect giving the seller the opportunity to move forward with another offer and but giving the buyer a couple of days in order to remove that contingency. Now, though, you've got a couple of triggers on this. Okay, over here we made reference to C7C1. Okay, well, you also have 7C2 or 3. So let's go through this 7C. Time to give notice to remove contingencies. Okay, so this is important. Okay, one, immediate right after notify the buyer, anytime after acceptance. So this basically says, boom, I'm just doing it. I don't have to wait whatever the contingency period is. So if I get that offer on day one, I come back to you on day one and I say, you got 2 days to remove your contingency or I'm moving on. Okay. Or you can check box 2, delayed right to notify buyer. So whatever, in this case, by default, you have to at least give the buyer 17 days to do their thing. Okay, so you can't cancel on day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You're basically stuck with them until day 17 or whatever day they put in here. And on this one, and this is the one that Medeli just got back, the buyer's agent prepared this. Check this box, and they have no right to notify the buyer. Seller shall not have the right to invoke the provisions of B during the terms of the agreement. So if you're the listing agent, you want to stay away from this one, from the plague, because basically you're stuck with these guys. So do not, and if you're the buyer's agent, I give the buyer's agent a little bit of credit because the buyer's agent prepared this and they had checked paragraph 7C3. I suppose their attempt was to protect their buyer, but in my mind, it just made me want to resist moving into escrow with this particular buyer and this agent completely. And I knew the agent, by the way. I knew the broker. So I was like, oh, wow, this buyer's agent thinks they're representing their buyer by saying, hey, seller has no right to cancel. But in my mind, it just kind of got our hair up a little bit. Okay, removal of contingencies. The contingencies only be removed in writing, just like anything else, guys. You understand this, by the way. We'll pause on this for just a second. All contingencies are in effect until they're removed in writing, until you use the form CR. If you don't remove them, they're not passively removed. Passive removal of contingencies mean, let's just use this for example. They said they had 17 days to remove it. In the old days, we had what was called passive removal of contingencies. So I think Dwayne's still on the call with us. We used to love that, especially if you were a listing agent, because passive removal, and that was the default in the contract. Passive meant if you had 17 days to do it, on day 18, it was removed automatically. Okay, just done. Okay, so if you fell asleep at the switch, well, too bad. You just remove your contingency. Active removal of contingencies is what we have today and what we've had for probably 20 years now. So all of the contracts by default require active removal of contingencies, which basically is what this is saying right here. Contingency can only be removed in writing. If you don't use a CR and remove that contingency in writing, it stays there. And that goes for everything, every single contingency that we have. Seller's right to cancel. Again, this goes through those trigger points. What they have to do. They've received the other offer. They've given the notice to the buyer, which was listed above, which is 2 days. And they've given them the notice to the buyer to perform, which I'd mentioned earlier on in this form. So if the seller goes through and checks the correct boxes, then they're good and they can cancel. And again, we could go through 2 hours of explaining the different cancellation rights, but I think I kind of went through that even before we got to paragraph 9. Buyer's right to cancel, it's a little simpler. Buyer's right to cancel basically falls within whatever their window is. So if going back up here, so if the buyer say 17 days. Okay. So if the default in the contract is the buyer had 17 days to remove the contingencies, at any point in time, the buyer could just say, hey, I haven't been able to get my house sold. I'm so sorry. I tried. I did the best I can. I'm canceling. And they pretty much can cancel anytime they want until the day that they actually remove the contingencies. The contingencies remain in place. We're using this as an example on the sale of their property, but you can use the same buyer's right to cancel for pretty much anything within the contract. So earlier we had mentioned a preliminary title report. So you can use preliminary title report interchangeable with sale of buyer's property. If the buyer hasn't approved and removed the contingency that they accept the preliminary title report, even if it's after day 17, even if it's on day 32, they can cancel anytime they want. I haven't removed it. I'm canceling. Why? Because I don't approve the prelim, or I haven't been able to get my property sold. Time for performance of the contract and obligations of delivery. Again, whatever the time spent, this is one of those time is of the essence type things. So whatever the time periods are in the agreement, those need to be upheld. So, and again, in so many of these cases, it's 17 days. What sort of effect does that have on the buyer's earnest money deposit? Buyer's deposit shall be delivered into escrow within 3 days. This is the standard language, but this is the deal, guys. Buyer's deposit is not at risk in any case until they remove the contingency. I get this all the time. You know, you're 42 days into a 30-day escrow. It's clear that this escrow is now definitely going to cancel. It probably should have been canceled weeks earlier. There's a $10,000 earnest money deposit. Listing agent calls me and says, okay, we're going to cancel. Oh my gosh, we waited too long and want to get that 10 grand. And have they removed contingency? Oh no, they never removed contingency. Well, then they're getting their 10 grand back. Just that simple. Yeah, but they should have done it on day 17. Today's day 42. Doesn't matter. If they haven't removed the contingencies, they're going to get the deposit back. Super, super simple. Okay, buyer and seller sign here. And then you've got this section down at the bottom, notice to remove buyer contingencies and provide proof of funds. Seller hereby gives notice to the buyer to remove those contingencies. So this is where we're putting them on notice. You've got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it. Generally speaking, this portion of the form is not going to be used all that often. Okay. Questions? I don't see anybody. I'm keeping an eye on you guys if you unmute, and you all are very, very quiet today. So all right, I'm going to keep on rolling. Okay, so the next form on my, and again, this is where maybe we're not doing this in order, is our time of possession, our TOPA form, which is going to be our tenant in possession form. So we're going to roll, and then by the way, then we're going to segue straight into the seller in possession and the residential lease after sale. So those are the 3 forms that we're going through next. So let's start with the tenant in possession form. Come over here. Let's go to my forms. Let's find my TOPA. Here we go. Okay, so tenant occupied property addendum. All right, so you have a couple of different options with this. So if you're selling rental property, and the rental property is going to remain a rental property. It doesn't matter whether it's a single family or whether it's a duplex, triplex, fourplex. Bottom line is if the intention is that you're going to close escrow and the tenant's going to stay, you're going to use this form. But you're also going to use this form if the tenant's going to move out, but at the time of the contract going in, it's occupied. So let's go through it. So you got a little bit multi-purpose here. Oh, by the way, this is very clear. This is designed for units from 1 to 4. So if you're selling a 5-plex or anything more than 4 units, this form does. You could use this form, but you guys understand 1 to 4 is still considered residential. 5 units and above is considered commercial. So there's different rules that apply. So this form is not to be used for anything more than 4 units. If you did use it, you know, don't get too much heartburn over that, but 1 to 4. Okay, so what are we amending? It's an addendum to the purchase agreement, same thing. The date of that agreement, Main Street, buyer, seller, and here we go. For the purposes of this tenant occupied addendum, the tenant shall mean an adult person other than the seller who is occupying the property, whether they're paying rent or not. So other than the seller, this is important. So you do not use this form if the person who's going to rent the property back is the seller. This is only for tenants. All right. And you don't, and they have to be adults. And in theory, they should be on a lease. Sometimes these things happen where, geez, they've been there for 20 years and we never had a lease. They just pay me $1,000 a month. Okay. Well, if you're representing the buyer, probably going to want to get some clarity on, what do you mean they're not on a lease? They just pay you $1,000 a month. Let's get a lease. Let's get something in writing prior to close of escrow, so we know exactly what we're getting ourselves into. You'll also notice whether they're paying rent or not. Whether they pay rent's irrelevant. Okay. So yeah, that's just that unit 4 is occupied by the gardener. And he cleans up the property, but doesn't pay me rent. We take it out and trade. Okay. Or they're in eviction. They're supposed to pay me rent, but they haven't. They use this form nevertheless. Okay. So the default paragraph 1A, tenant is to remain in possession. Buyer shall take the property subject to the rights of the existing tenants. Boom. Okay. Done. All right. Or nope, the tenant actually is going to be leaving. Okay, so the property will be delivered vacant. So they're going to be leaving prior to close of escrow. Now you can do kind of a twofer on this. If it's a fourplex, you can say units A and B will be delivered vacant, but that's it. Unit C and D will not. So you could basically have kind of a use this form for both. If it's a single family and if you're going to make it vacant, and then yes, the principal residence will be delivered vacant. If the seller, after exercise of good faith, attempts to subject applicable law to remove existing tenants by close of escrow or 5 days, buyer may cancel. So what they're talking about there is, let's suppose we're going to close escrow in a month from now or 2 months from now, and today I have every intention that, hey, I'm going to deliver the property. Let's just keep this simple. I just have a house with a tenant in it. I'm going to deliver this single family residence vacant. What they're saying here is the seller has exercised good faith. I have tried and tried and tried to get this tenant out, but they're not moving out. Okay. Yeah. And basically the default, by the way, is 5 days prior to close of escrow. If that happens, the buyer can cancel the contract and get their deposit back. You could, in theory, negotiate, the buyer could proceed, you could close, you could do a variety of things. But if, be careful in those cases. I mean, if you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent, the buyer, they don't care, they'll take on the tenant and they're okay, fine. You have your own agency and if that's how you want to proceed, that's great. But if you represent the buyer and you're recommending the buyer close escrow on a tenant on a property that was supposed to be vacant and is not vacant, and for whatever reason it's not, Nikki Luna just went through this. I love Nikki. She's not with the company anymore. I have nothing bad to say about her, but Nikki calls me last summer and she represented the buyer. And the property is supposed to be delivered vacant. Bottom line, it's not delivered vacant. I said, well, don't close. Get this thing resolved. Well, lo and behold, they closed. Escrow closed. The property was not delivered vacant. And we went through, 4, 5, 6 months of pain. And this was a property where the buyer had intended on moving into that property 3 days after close of escrow. And they were not able to do that for 6 or 7 months and a lot of money, a lot of lost money. So at any rate, so if the seller cannot deliver possession, buyer has the option to cancel or kind of renegotiate. Now, this is a little bit different. Even if pursuant to the agreement, the seller remains in possession after close of escrow, no tenant shall remain. So that would be the example where you've got the fourplex. Okay. So the seller is going to be in unit 1 and there's tenants in unit 2, 3, and 4. They have to go out. Or it's a single family house. The seller remains in possession after close of escrow, but his dirtbag brother-in-law rents from him the back bedroom. Brother-in-law's got to be out. Okay. So the only person that would be allowed, and that's important because a seller in possession who doesn't want to get out is categorized differently than a tenant in possession who doesn't want to get out after close of escrow. Tenants have more rights, sellers don't. Because so that's very important. That's why that seller in possession form, that SIP form is so important. And there's a totally different set of rules for sellers carrying over after escrow than tenants carrying after escrow. Okay, tenants that do remain in possession, well, these are their rights. Okay, well, they have earnest, they have deposits, they have rent situations. All of that stuff has to be disclosed to the buyer. Deposits have to be credited to the buyer. Unearned rents need to be, they refer to unearned rents. I don't normally call them unearned rents. I call them prepaid rents. So today's the 23rd of February. So if a tenant paid the rent for February, I know there's only 28 days, but for rent purposes, there's 30 days in the month of February. If we close escrow today, the tenant stays in there. There are 7 days of unearned rent, meaning the seller did not earn that rent. So not only does the seller have to give the tenant's earnest money deposit over to the buyer, and the example I just gave you, the seller would need to credit the buyer 7 days of prepaid or unearned rent. And by the way, guys, generally speaking, all rent is prepaid. Rent's due on the first of the month. It covers the 30 days, ahead. Okay. So that needs to be done. Any sort of government compliance needs to be complied to, whatever that may be. So there's a rent control in this particular city, or the tenants have these particular rights. All of those transfer, none of those can be waived. Anything along those lines. Proposed changes. Okay. Hey, we've made a change to the existing lease. So let's suppose the agreement is prior to close of escrow, this is going to change. That's going to change. This tenant's going to extend. This tenant's going to pay more rent. All of that would need to be done within whatever the time specified is. Any objections? Somewhere in here, it's probably going to talk about an estoppel certificate, but in effect, everything they're talking about in paragraph C identifies what's the existing lease say, and is that existing lease going to be in place at close of escrow? If it is, great, give me an estoppel certificate stating this is my rent, this is what my late fee is, this is when my rent's due, this is how much my earnest money deposit is. This basically says, oh, and by the way, that all applies, but we made the following change. Your due date is now on the 1st, it's not on the 10th, whatever it happens to be. And of course, you want tenants to sign off on all that as well. Any personal property included in the sale. So you be careful on this. Sometimes when you transfer a property with tenants, you might think, for example, that the stove and the refrigerator and this and that and the mini blinds are part of the property. And then no, there was an arrangement between the tenant and the owner that, hey, I bought that stove. When I leave as a tenant, I'm taking it with me. These are the type of things that potentially can be problems. I've had them happen periodically. Seller documentation and additional disclosures. Okay, again, within the time specified, any additional documentation or disclosures need to be made and delivered to the buyer. Okay, what are some of those things? Well, geez, how about the rental agreements? We need the rental agreements. Any agreement that I have with, how much is the rent, everything that we just talked about, that needs to be disclosed. If you're dealing with small time landlords, a lot of times they don't have this, but anybody who's a professional landlord who has a property management company like ours, or certainly has multiple units, they will have an income and expense statement. Sophisticated buyers and sellers on rental units demand and want an income and expense. What's the P&L? What are your rents? What are your expenses? Who's behind? What's the plumbing look like? Chris, I have a client who's losing his mind right now because every time we turn around, there's plumbing problems on the property. And if he was to sell that property right now and he would disclose to the buyer his income and expense, the plumbing line of expense would kind of jump out at you. Wow, why are there so many plumbing bills on this thing? Well, I don't know. Maybe we got a problem. Maybe we got a piping issue on this property. So you want to get them that. Estoppel certificates. I get calls on this all the time. Generally speaking, the calls I get is they don't know what it is. So estoppel certificate it's just a fancy word for let's just have the tenant verify what the terms and conditions are. That's it. So this is my lease. It's a separate form. And it says, you're the tenant, Lance Martin. This is your wife's name. You got 3 kids. You got a dog named Buster. You pay $1,000 on rent. Your security deposit is $1,200. Your late fee. It just lays it all out. And tenants need to sign that. I'm telling you guys, if you represent the buyer and you cannot get an estoppel certificate, which seems to be impossible for some crazy reason, but you cannot get an estoppel certificate from the listing agent and the seller, you need to do some hard stops on that. They should not be that hard to get that document prepared, get it in front of a tenant, have the tenant say, yep, that's right, that's my rent. And they sign it. If you can't get it, then just pause. Any survey plans, any permits, structural modifications, we'll go through a lot more of this in other disclosures. It's very, very repetitive, but that information needs to be sent. Again, any other seller's representation as it relates to what's going on to the tenant, for example, current or pending lawsuits. Well, what is that? Well, it could be an eviction, or it could be the tenant is suing me because they claim the property's full of mold and my kids are sick. Okay. All of that stuff needs to be disclosed to the buyer. And if you're not, you're asking for big trouble. Okay. Buyer and seller sign here. Pretty straightforward stuff. Any questions? I don't see anybody unmuted. Okay, so that is the TOPA form, tenant occupied property addendum. The next one, I'm not going to go back to the contract because I already mentioned it. The next one is the seller in possession form. Now, we didn't really use these a whole lot. As a matter of fact, even up until a few years ago, Norm and I would kind of argue with each other a little bit because Norm was insistent that every single transaction where the seller is going to remain in possession, you want to get an SIP form. You know, again, being a little old school here, and again, I'll pick on Dwayne because Dwayne and I have been doing this a long time together. You know, we didn't use, if it was the seller is going to deliver possession 3 days after close of escrow, we didn't really use an SIP form. Okay, but like it's going to be 3 days. It's kind of standard. What's the big deal? Well, if Norm was here, he'd say, well, the big deal is what happens if they don't move out. Okay. And there is some contractual protection within the contract, but trust me, it's way better to get the seller in possession form, which, by the way, the difference between a seller and a tenant is this word right here. The seller is licensed to remain in the property. The seller does not have the same rights and protections as a tenant. This is a license for them to stay there, and that license is based upon the RPA in this. So bottom line is, if you have a seller that is not going to be delivering the property vacant at close of escrow, they need 1 day, they need 3 days, or they need up to 29 days, take the extra effort, get the SIP form, and then you'll live a happier life, and Norm can look down on us from heaven with a smile on his face, because this was one of his big forms that he loved. So 29 days or less, seller in possession form, addendum to the purchase agreement with the date, address, buyer and seller. So basically, this sentence here pretty much sums up the form. It's the most important sentence of the entire thing. This addendum is intended to grant the seller a license to remain in possession. There are some legal connotations to the seller having a license. All right. Everything else are the terms. Everything else, frankly, looks very much like a regular lease agreement, but the main difference is they're licensed. So as we go through the rest of this form, kind of sort of think of it, because it's almost impossible not to think of it as kind of a landlord-tenant agreement. So what do we got? Okay, they can stay for 3 days after close of escrow, or you can give them a hard date. When are they going to move out? Great. Are they paying for that? Is there a dollar consideration for them to stay? Yes, they're going to pay $100 a day, or they're going to pay $10,000 for whatever it happens to be. This is kind of sort of where like those per diems come in. Generally speaking, and I don't think this is the best way to do it, but what a lot of agents tend to do is they sit back and say, okay, well, the tenant's mortgage payment is going to be $3,000 a month. So 3,000 divided by 30 is $100 a day. They got to pay $100 a day. That seems to be the formula that agents use. I think that's frankly, just a crappy formula. If I represent the buyer, what's it worth to you? Or represent the seller, it's not just the mortgage payment, it's inconvenience, it's this, it's that, it's whatever, or it might be nothing. Hey, we're going to let him, it's such a great deal. We're going to give them 3 days. We're not going to charge them. We're going to give them 10 days. We're not going to charge them. Okay. So that's completely up to you guys. I would suggest you give a little bit of thought to this per diem number. To me, and again, I represent more sellers than buyers, but in any case, I like it to be a big number. I want it to be a number that motivates that seller to get out of that property. Okay, what happens if they don't pay? Oh my gosh, there's a late fee. Generally speaking, my recommendation on this, however, is this money is collected. This money is collected at close of escrow. So if they're going to stay 10 days and it's $100 a day, okay, well, geez, that $1,000 is going to be paid at close of escrow. Anything past that, I'm bringing the hammer down. Okay. In theory, you could do the payment arrangements a little differently, and there could be late fees and NFS, but I'd stay away from that. Seller's obligation. Again, the seller has an obligation for the condition, just like a tenant would be. They've got to maintain the property. They got to keep the pool up. They got to do all that sort of stuff. They got to deliver possession at the time agreed to. Delivery of possession fee. If there's an additional, actually, let me double check this. Additional license fee. Okay, so again, they could put in additional stuff. Hey, the $1,000 is what we're paying, but at the same time, if I go over a day, it's $300 a day. Oh, by the way, here's a $5,000 deposit to make sure that I move out on a timely fashion. So you can handle that. Utilities. Is the seller paying utilities? Maybe. Again, I think most of these you guys are going to do. Seller in theory is going to be out 2, 3, 4, 5 days after close of escrow. You're not going to charge them anything. You're not going to charge them for utilities. They're just going to be there and they're going to move out. Okay. But if it's a longer term, you can negotiate that out. Entry. Seller should make the property available for the purchase of entry. So, hey, escrow's closed. I got to let the buyer in. I don't want to let the buyer in. I'm not going to be out for another 5. He can wait 3 more days. That's not what it says. Got to let the buyer in. They want to come in. They want to measure for drapes. They want to do this. They want to have the contractor come in and give them a bid for paint. It's got to be done. Oh, by the way, not only that, by default, seller gives them keys at close of escrow. I don't want to give them keys. They can get the keys. Well, by default, they get a copy of the keys. So other terms of concession, that's pretty straightforward. Assignment and subletting, seller should not have the right to assign or sublet. Okay, nobody else gets in there. By the way, they assign and sublet, that person in there, that license turns into a tenancy relationship. So we're specifically prohibiting them from doing that. Seller needs to maintain their insurance. Seller shall waive any breach to be construed by a continuing waiver. What they're referring to there is if, let's suppose it says seller's going to be out in 4 days and they're not, and now they're in their day 5 and day 6 and day 7. If you as the buyer are willing to, okay, I'll work with you. Okay, I'm going to waive that breach. I'll give you an extra couple of days. Just get the hell out. That doesn't mean that you're going to do it forever. Okay, hey, you said I could have an extra week, so you did it last time. You're going to give me another week. No, I'm not. You've worn out your welcome. That's what they're. And that waiver of breach, you'll see that in other parts of the contract. Basically, it just means if one party waived a part of the contract once, it doesn't mean they're going to waive it every time. And that's pretty standard language.
Hey, Lance.
Yep, go ahead, Misty.
I just want to back up real quick. That section about the defaulting to the buyers getting keys.
Yep.
That's new on this revision of the SIP. That's brand new. It
Okay.
didn't used to default to that. So anybody who uses this form know that is a new thing, that it didn't used to default to that at close of escrow, that the buyers get keys.
Yep.
So if you don't want that, you need to make sure that you're going in and checking that box.
Good catch, Misty. You know what? I used to teach contract college more often than I have. I kind of took over for Norm last year, and prior to that, it's been a while. But I also used to be involved more at CAR, and now I'm back at CNR. So the good news is next time we have form revisions, I will get the red line version of these form revisions. So what Misty just caught for the whole class, which I did not catch. And honestly, I guess I learned something. I don't remember one way or the other. I'll take Misty at face value. That wasn't there. So moving forward, this is one reason, again, I feel like I'm channeling.
We use this form all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
well,
was a very big catch for me.
Yeah, huge. But moving forward on this, we're going to be doing contract college and we'll do the red line revisions. So, and I'll get those from CAR. I just haven't been able to get them for a few years, or maybe I haven't asked. But anyway, very good catch. So if you're not, and this is another reason why, guys, when these new forms come out, you gotta get into contract college, go through them, read the damn things for God's sakes, because these are the type of changes, especially when you're a seasoned agent, that you miss. You just absolutely miss it because, oh, geez, when did that get in there? Geez, that's been in there for a year and a half. Well, now it's biting you in the butt. Okay, good catch, Misty. Okay, here, you could put in some additional terms here if you needed to, just keep it short if you do. And then just real quick, and we're going to stop here at the end of this form. I know it's 1:30. So let's read the note and let's get it finished. Regardless of the length of time in possession originally agreed, if the buyer and seller intend to extend, if they want to extend from the 29 days, buyer and seller are advised to consult a qualified local tenant landlord, and the tenant relationship may be inadvertently created. So this is what they're talking about here, guys. Up here at the top, this is a license. The law says if you do a tenancy on a seller in possession after close of escrow, 29 days or less, it's a license. And if the seller's in breach, easier to evict, easier to get possession, easier to hold the damages. Once you go past day 29, you're very well maybe creating a landlord-tenant relationship inadvertently. Okay, I've created that relationship, and now getting them out of the property via an eviction and all the rest of that can become increasingly more difficult. Another reason, when you're doing one of these escrows and you have that option, we're going to do an SIP or an RL, what is it? RLAS, RAL, I got my acronyms messed up. RLAS, residential lease after sale. Okay. Residential lease after sale, boom, it's a tenant relationship. Okay. You've created a tenant relationship with that seller. Why? Because it's more than 30 days or more. Okay. Anyways, buyer and seller sign, we go about our business. Everybody's happy. Okay. So this is the deal, guys. We're going to stop here. I do apologize. I've been so proud that we've kept all this in Canva and it made it nice and clean and pretty. And I just had a technical failure here getting this done. So this is what we're going to do. So everything we did today, first of all, we're going to get all of the forms loaded. So the next, when you go in, hopefully it'll happen later today, but if you went in and you check that one little PDF on the very first page, it'll have all of the 103 forms that we went through. We will also go back into the Canva, and everything we covered today, we will carve it out and we'll put it in the Canva as if we normally had done it. And then we certainly will be back in the Canva presentation next Thursday. So real quick before we let you go, it looks like I've lost maybe one of you. Can you guys give me some feedback real quick? I'd like to extend this class to 2 hours. I think if we go to 2 hours, we can get this knocked out in probably another 4 weeks. Anybody have any heartburn with 2?
I'm good with 2, Lance.
I think it's good for 2.
I'm good with 2.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
2 is good. 2 is good.
all right, it's unanimous. I'll stop with the 4. So any of you guys that, you know what happens. It's like when you get into that thing, the first person who comes in, they rule the roost. So for those of you that were no, too late, you've been overruled. Okay, so starting next week, we're going to go from 12 to 2. We'll be able to make some time up on this, and then I'll have a little bit better idea of how many more weeks we have till we're finished. But anyway, guys, peace out. Have a great day. Somebody's typing something.
Thank you.
No heartburn with 2. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate that. Okay, guys, have a great day.
Thank you,
Talk soon. Go sell something. All right. Bye-bye.